The war ends if Ukraine cedes the Donbas. That has been Russian President Vladimir Putin's claim ever since peace negotiations began, and he justifies that request by claiming that the Donbas is going to fall sooner rather than later anyway. The numbers seem to support him. According to some sources, Russia controls 88% of the Donbas, but not all is as it seems. Far from being on the verge of falling, the Donbas is set to provide Russia with its biggest test yet in nearly 4 years of warfare. Putin tried to break Ukraine in the Donbas, he failed and ended up breaking Russia instead. Not that you would know that if you listened to Putin and the US negotiators trying to force through a peace plan for the Ukraine war. The question of territory has been the main sticking point in every attempt to declare any sort of ceasefire or peace since US President Donald Trump and his administration began negotiations. Putin demands the entire Donbas if Russia is to withdraw its forces, while Ukraine stands firm, stating that it won't hand over the remaining portions of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions that make up the Donbas for free, United 24 media reports. Putin's maximalist approach to peace negotiations isn't likely to change, as Russia's leader wants to create the perception that his country is winning the war. Perception is reality in Putin's mind, even if the situation on the ground doesn't quite match up to his many claims. Among those claims is that Ukraine ultimately has no choice when it comes to the Donbas. Putin made that much clear on December 4th, which is when the BBC reported on comments that Putin made about the Donetsk region. Either we liberate these territories by force, or Ukrainian troops will leave these territories, Putin blared, which tells you everything you need to know about the picture that Russia's president is trying to paint of the Donbas situation. The US appears to have started taking a liking to that particular picture. AA reports that the US is actively pushing for Ukraine to leave the Donbas, thus giving Russia everything that Putin wants. The outlet quotes an unnamed European official who says, "Americans insist that Ukraine must leave the Donbas, one way or another." This push comes even though Ukraine still holds 30% of the Donbas region, including parts of Donetsk, which, as you'll find out in a moment, is going to be far harder for Russia to take than Putin wants the US to think. As for why the US is making the push for Ukraine to cede its territory, the European official had some ideas. Maybe Trump also wants it to happen fast, so his team is forced to explain to him they are not the ones to blame for why this is not happening as fast as he wanted, the official claims. Trump had claimed that he would end the Ukraine war on day one of his presidency. It's been almost a year and there is no end in sight. With Trump growing increasingly impatient, it appears that he sees Ukraine giving up the Donbas as the easy way to belatedly deliver on a promise he made on the campaign trail. The impression Russia gives of the Donbas would suggest that the US is right to make that push. However, looks can be deceiving, and when it comes to the last 30% of Donetsk, Russia is far from being on the verge of victory. Ukraine doesn't want to hand over territory it still holds for a simple reason. That final 30% is some of the most well-fortified land in all of Ukraine. Within the portion of Donetsk that remains in Ukraine's hands lies the key cities of Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. They're joined by several other Ukrainian strongholds, including the embattled city of Pokrovsk, Druzhkivka and Konstantinivka. Together, these 5 settlements make up what many have dubbed the fortress belt of Donetsk, and indeed of Ukraine as a whole. And there's very good reason why this line of cities has earned that name. Let's focus on Pokrovsk for a moment. Of the 5 cities mentioned, Pokrovsk is the one most at risk, as Russia has repeatedly claimed to have taken the city, only for Ukraine to refute those claims. Fighting is ongoing in the city's streets, and though it is likely that Pokrovsk is going to fall, with the question now turning to when rather than if, that fall will come at great cost to Russia. Russia has been pushing for that city for well over a year, and the scale of its losses shows how damaging that push has been. On October 6th, former Forbes writer David Axe claimed that Russia had suffered 100,000 casualties in the Pokrovsk direction during the first 9 months of 2025. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky claims that Ukraine's drone operators scored 25,000 confirmed kills against Russia in October alone, almost all of which were in or around Pokrovsk. That's 125,000 Russian casualties for one city in 10 months of fighting. More have died both before and since, as Putin tries to crack just one of the 5 fortress belt cities. The point we're making here is that Putin is trying to act as though Donetsk is on the verge of falling. However, it's taken his forces well over a year to make real progress into Pokrovsk, and the city still stands. United 24 media notes that the same can be said about another small Donetsk settlement named Chaziv Yar. Much like Pokrovsk, Russia claimed to have taken this settlement, only this claim came toward the end of July. That supposed capture was supposed to make a turning point in Russia's entire Donbas offensive, the BBC reported Russian military bloggers as saying at the time. However, as Russia was claiming victory in Chasiv Yar, Ukraine was refuting those same claims. July 31st saw the Kyiv Post report on comments made by the spokesperson of the Khortytsia operational group defending the region, Viktor Trehubov, who said, "The situation in the town has remained unchanged recently, despite Russian lies." United 24 media backs the Ukrainian claim many months later, noting that Chasiv Yar is still a barrier to the Russian advance deeper into Donetsk, a shocking 20 months after Putin first ordered assaults to begin against the city. What we see here is the reason why Ukraine's fortress belt has earned the name that it has. Chasiv Yar is fast approaching 2 solid years of holding out. Pokrovsk hasn't fallen despite well over a year of fighting, and Putin dedicating 170,000 of his soldiers to that city in 2025. As Putin tries to frame Donetsk as a region on the verge of collapsing, the reality is far different. Donetsk isn't going to collapse anytime soon. Even with the eventual falls of Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar, Russia still has a lot more work to do, and it will have to topple even larger settlements to complete the takeover of Donetsk and ultimately the Donbas. But we didn't mention the sheer time Russia has taken in its assaults on Chasiv Yar and Pokrovsk for no reason. Every extra week that Russia's forces spend trying to topple those settlements is another week that Ukraine has to strengthen the fortifications that lie behind. As United 24 media puts it, the Donetsk region is now a dense network of military fortifications that stretches for dozens of kilometers, as clearly shown on maps. These lines of defenses are layered across the region, many of them positioned on higher ground. If Russia thought it had struggled to take Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar, it has a nightmare in store for it when it tries to take the rest of the fortress belt. In October, The Telegraph revealed just how terrifying that nightmare will be in an article in which it claimed that the fortress belt is now a place where NATO doctrine no longer applies. It tells the story of a region that is patrolled by countless aerial drones and through which Ukrainian ground robots make constant supply runs. Open trenches have been replaced by these robots, some of which handle logistics, and others of which create massive kill zones that Russia's soldiers will have to navigate once they're finally able to push on from places like Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar. Russia is attempting to respond by organizing a drone siege of the fortress belt that it hopes will make the region easier to capture. However, drones cannot take territory. For that, you need soldiers on the ground, tanks providing armor, and, as one unnamed Ukrainian officer tells The Telegraph, if Moscow pushes in this direction, they will struggle in the urban areas and suffer thousands of casualties. Before those urban battles can even begin, Russia's forces have a literal minefield of defenses to navigate before they can even get close to the remaining cities in the fortress belt. Ukraine has prepared diligently for a fighting retreat from its most embattled fortress cities, and the soldiers that will leave eventually will hole up in places like Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. To follow them, Russian troops will have to navigate the hundreds of miles of trenches and other barriers that remain. Tank traps are everywhere, as are barbed wire mazes that will shred any troops that aren't careful with their advance. Secret minefields have been laid, and Ukraine has likely set up stay-behind bunkers that it can use to conduct operations in the Russian rear as the slow crawl toward the rest of the Donetsk fortress belt is ongoing. Add the thousands of drones and the kill zones they've created into the mix, and the fall of cities like Pokrovsk won't signal an end to Russia's fight for the Donbas. It will be a new, even bloodier beginning to a battle that looks set to cost Putin hundreds of thousands more of his soldiers. Of course, all of these fortifications hold value for Russia too. That's why Putin wants them. If the fortress belt falls, Russia gains the high ground and the Ukrainian-made defenses that we've already discussed. As The Conversation noted in an August article, the fortress belt would then become the perfect staging ground for a deeper push into Ukraine. Russia could defend its new positions thanks to the work that Ukraine has done, and it could launch assaults from the higher ground into central Ukraine. However, that's all for a future that Putin hasn't created yet. To take the fortress belt, Putin either needs to convince Ukraine to cede the cities that still stand, or Russia has to fight for them. And despite Putin's claims that Russia is willing to fight, a battle for the rest of the fortress belt is the last thing that Putin wants right now. He needs Ukraine to cede the Donbas. That's why he's pushing the narrative that he's created so hard with the US, and it's why he's made Ukraine's ceding of the Donbas region a key part of his peace demands. Putin knows that Russia stands to lose far more than it already has if it has to take the rest of Donetsk by force. Zelensky knows it too, which is why he has once again said that Ukraine has no intention of ceding the Donbas. "We definitely do not want to give anything up. That's what we are fighting for," Zelensky said as he flew to Brussels for a meeting with several European Union and NATO leaders. "We have no legal right to do so under Ukrainian law, our constitution, international law, or to be honest, moral law." Even if Ukraine were to cede the Donbas, Zelensky knows that any agreement put in place is unlikely to hold. Putin has a very long history of claiming that he will do something, only to later break his word. Ukraine has been the victim of the Russian leader's lies many times in recent years. In fact, Putin's decision to launch his initial campaign of aggression against Ukraine in 2014 saw him violate the 1997 Russian-Ukraine Treaty of Friendship that confirmed Ukraine's sovereign stature and saw Russia promise to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, the Kyiv independent claims. The Minsk Protocol, signed during that initial conflict, was supposed to begin a ceasefire on September 5, 2014. That ceasefire was broken 10 times by Russia's soldiers in the aftermath. 6 years later, when a full and comprehensive ceasefire was declared in eastern Ukraine on July 27, 2020, it took just 30 minutes for Russian Marines to break that ceasefire and launch an assault. These are just a handful of the many instances of Putin breaking his word when it comes to Ukraine. Zelensky and his people have no confidence that Putin will stop trying to take Ukraine, even if the Donbas is ceded. Beyond the broken promises, Russia has shown throughout the war that it's interested in more than just the Donbas too. As United 24 media notes, Russia's forces poured in from Ukraine's north, south and east during the initial invasion in February 2022, immediately signaling that Putin had more than the Donbas on his mind. In the years since, Putin's forces have opened up fronts in Kharkiv, Sumy, Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk, none of which are part of the Donbas, but all of which face ongoing Russian assaults. Ukraine believes that granting Putin the Donbas now will only set the stage for future attacks on these regions. So Ukraine refuses to hand over the territory. It knows that peace won't last and that Putin has designs on far more territory than he claims. We've highlighted just how damaging the battles for Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar have been for the Russian military. But they are far from the only fights that have cost Russia tens of thousands of its soldiers. The battle for Bakhmut lasted for nearly a year and resulted in the loss of tens of thousands of Wagner mercenaries and soldiers, United 24 media points out. Another major Russian campaign, the assault on Avdiivka, involved 120,000 troops, with 1 in 3 becoming irreversible losses. Toretsk took months of siege. None of these cities was as well fortified as those that remain in Ukraine's control in Donetsk. Plus, Ukraine has learned lessons from all of those losses that ensure that it will make the sieges to come even more grueling and attritional for Russia's forces. The same outlet also highlights the scale of Russia's losses in 2025 alone. By the end of the year, United 24 media says Russia is likely to surpass 400,000 irrecoverable losses. That will make this year the deadliest one for Russia so far in the war, especially as more Russian soldiers are dying versus being wounded than at any other point during the war. The ratio of dead to injured is now 1 dead for every 1.3 wounded, which is a ratio that tells us 2 things. Ukraine has become more effective at killing Russian soldiers, and Russia is less able to provide those soldiers with the armor they need to defend themselves against Ukraine. This amounts to an enormous manpower cost to Russia, and the country is starting to see the effects. In August, Forbes wrote that Russia faces a future labor shortage. Part of that is due to the country's low birth rate, which stands at about 1.4 births per woman, when 2.1 births are needed to ensure the stable replacement of the Russian population. The loss of over 1 million soldiers in Ukraine is also a massive contributor, and it all adds up to a country that will soon have nowhere near the number of people it needs to sustain its economy. By 2030, Russia will need between 2.4 million and 3 million additional workers, and it's not going to be getting those people domestically. More migration into the country will be needed, which also creates a demographic issue that some argue threatens the future of Russia and its culture. Putin's push for the Donbas exacerbates all of these issues. Simon Tisdall of The Guardian adds that these population issues come at a time when Russia stands on the precipice of economic disaster. Inflation in Russia hovers at around 8% and has been higher in 2025. Interest rates are still above 16%. Russia has a rising budget deficit, an oil sector that isn't pulling in the revenue the country needs it to pull in, and soaring consumer taxes that are ruining the people who live in the country. Plus, the price of vodka has risen by 5%. Some Russians may feel that particular pain more than the many others that Putin has inflicted on his own people since he invaded Ukraine. The broken Russia over which Putin now presides is a direct result of his unsatiated desire to claim the Donbas for his country. Almost 4 years of warfare have crippled Russia's economy and helped to create a population shortfall that will have ramifications for years to come. This is the reality that Putin doesn't want the world to see. The real picture that sits on the canvas, behind the picture of the inevitable downfall of the Donbas that Putin is trying to paint. Still, Putin will force his soldiers to fight on, and even though the Donbas won't fall as easily as Putin claims, it may still fall. It will just take another 4 years of Russia to complete its full occupation of the region, Zelensky claims. Speaking about a conversation he held with Trump in August, Ukraine's president said, "I explained to US President Donald Trump that the talks about them, Russia, occupying our Donbas by the end of 2025 are all just chatter. Zelensky also revealed that Putin is pushing hard for Ukraine to cede the Donbas because he could position that territory gain as a victory to the Russian people. Whether that's a victory that Putin could sell to Russia remains to be seen, but much to Putin's chagrin, Ukraine isn't falling for his claims of Donbas domination, even if the US currently sees things Putin's way. When Russia's troops start getting torn to pieces in the fortress belt that remains to be taken, Putin won't be able to hide what's really happening in the Donbas anymore. And if it's going to take another 4 years of fighting to claim that territory by force, the already broken Russia that Putin has created will be ground into dust by the time that he can call the Donbas Russian territory. Putin's forces have gained a minuscule amount of territory in return for the untold gallons of Russian blood that have been spilled in Ukraine. When we talk about Putin breaking Russia through the war that he started, we mean it very literally. Russia is being bled dry for just 1.45% of Ukraine so far. And you can find out more about what that means for the country's future in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of what awaits Russia's forces in Donetsk's fortress belt. And thank you for watching.